My little sister turned me in to our violent dad after I protected her from his methods, so I tore our family apart. 6 months later, he sent a man to teach me a lesson. My father was the kindest, most chivalrous gentleman I'd ever met, except only in public, because as soon as the doors were closed, he turned into Kim Jong-un. You see, he had these insane rules that didn't even make any sense, yet me, my mother, and my 4 other siblings were forced to follow them. We couldn't speak at the dinner table unless we were spoken to first. None of our rooms had any doors, other than his bedroom and office, of course. We had to greet him with a hug and a kiss on the cheek, LOL, as soon as he walked in the door. And if we broke his rules, it's not like he'd hit us or anything. He'd just force us to hold a wall sit position until our faces turned so red we couldn't hold it anymore. Or if he was in a good mood, he'd sit us down at the table in front of the entire family. There, we had to present a slideshow of why we were such disappointments, with a minimum of 10 examples. And each family member had to contribute too. But I never really thought it was that bad, because whenever I brought it up to my mom or siblings, they'd always just say, at least he doesn't hit us. But there was one rule that he never had to punish us for breaking, because none of us dared to go near it, and that was to never ask about his work, like ever. I don't even think our mom even knew what his job was, because he worked from home but rarely had his laptop open. And every day there were sleazy businessmen walking in and out of our home. They all looked the same: Eastern European, gold chain around their necks, big dark sunglasses. Sometimes I could hear them laughing, but other times my dad would be barking orders at them in a language I couldn't understand. All I really knew was that it paid the bills, and we never struggled with money. Before I continue the story, you should probably know that I'm the second youngest child, and the youngest is my sister. We'll call her Soso, who was 6 years younger than me. Soso was the only one in my family I actually liked. During the slideshow punishments, she wouldn't take the opportunity to laugh at me or try and make me cry. Instead, she would say as little as possible. She had the type of heart that was impossible to turn evil. I always swore to myself that no matter what, I would always protect her. I never knew how much that promise would ruin my life, because one day, when she was 10, she broke the forbidden rule. We were sitting around the table in silence when she spoke. "Daddy, can I help you with work one day?" My spine stiffened. I didn't even look up, just focused on twirling the peas around my plate with my fork. "You don't need to know." My dad's voice was stern, like it was a warning. "But Daddy, I never get to see you, and I'm good at organizing." Suddenly, my dad aggressively sat up from his chair so hard it fell over, but instead of dragging her to the corner and forcing her to hold the infamous wall sit, he just walked away. I was even more scared than Soso and was watching her with intense tunnel vision. Soon, my dad stomped back in with what looked like a black leather belt in his hand. My body processed what was going on before my brain did. I immediately wrapped myself around her, and the first hit landed on my back. This made my dad 10 times angrier, and he used his strength to pull us apart and lock me outside. I was forced to watch through the window as Soso was helplessly wailed on, and none of my other siblings even did anything. They just retreated to their rooms and made sure not to get in my dad's way. With each hit, I felt my heart grow colder, and that's when I checked the time. It was 4 p.m. on a Thursday, which meant the CPS office would still be open. I called them and quickly blurted out everything I could think of. The woman on the other side seemed extremely concerned, and I begged her to make sure that the claim stayed anonymous, that she didn't expose it was me. She promised she would, and the next morning I woke up to my dad answering the door to the social worker. Well, he plastered on his gentleman-like persona, and within 2 minutes, she had given my name and that I had called yesterday. There were a few seconds of silence after she said it, the kind that you could only pick up on if you were looking out for it. "Ha ha ha ha," my dad pretended to laugh. Sometimes kids can get so confused. This made her laugh too, and instead of taking any other necessary action, she drove away. What happened next is something I have no interest in remembering or describing, but that night, I spent hours crying. My entire body was vibrating with pain. I think it was 2 a.m. when Soso came to visit me. I thought she was going to hug me, but no. "You shouldn't have betrayed Daddy," was the only thing she whispered before walking out. That was the day my home went from North Korea to Germany in the 1940s. Me and Soso used to break rules together in secret, but now she was telling on me for everything. My older siblings started wailing on me when my dad was too tired to. Sometimes for no other reason than they just felt like it, and I let them. Because once I was done, everyone would regret how they treated me. After Soso's betrayal, I basically shut down. I stopped talking to everyone in the house unless absolutely necessary. What was the point? I'd tried to do the right thing, and it had completely backfired. My back was covered in welts from the belt, angry red lines that stung whenever my shirt rubbed against them, and my own sister, the one person I thought I could trust, had turned on me. The betrayal hurt worse than any physical pain my father could inflict. I started spending most of my time in the basement, pretending to fix an old bike I'd found in the garage. My dad didn't care as long as I was out of his sight. The basement was cold and damp, with concrete walls that sweated moisture and a persistent smell of mildew, but it became my sanctuary. No one bothered me there. While I tinkered with the rusty chain and flat tires, methodically cleaning each gear and spoke, I was actually documenting everything that happened in our house. I couldn't keep a journal. My dad had burned all my notebooks after the CPS incident, making me watch as the pages curled and blackened in the backyard fire pit. So I started taking photos of our injuries whenever I could do so safely. I used an old phone I'd found in the basement and kept hidden. I also recorded audio whenever possible, capturing my father's rages and threats. For backup, I carved key dates and events into the wood under the basement stairs with an old screwdriver. June 15th, Dad hit Brian with belt for coming home 10 minutes late. June 18th, Natalie locked in closet for 3 hours for talking on phone too long. June 20th, Mom's eye bruised, says she fell. The wood carvings weren't my primary evidence, but they served as a timeline I could reference when organizing my digital proof. I knew someday these records would matter. I just had to survive long enough to use them. My silence really bothered my dad. He was used to breaking us down verbally, making us cry and beg for forgiveness. My new silent treatment strategy took that power away from him. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened whenever I passed him without speaking, in the way his eyes followed me with growing frustration. So he made a new rule specifically for me. Before every meal, I had to stand up and recite one thing I was grateful to him for. If I refused, I didn't eat. The first time he announced this rule, everyone stared at me, waiting to see what I'd do. The dining room felt suffocating, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I was starving. They'd been limiting my food as punishment, but the thought of thanking him for anything made me want to vomit. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, looked him dead in the eye, and said in a monotone voice, "I'm grateful you haven't killed us yet." Then I walked out without eating, my stomach growling in protest, but my dignity intact. I went 3 days without a proper meal before hunger won out. At the next dinner, I stood and mumbled, grateful for the roof over my head. My dad smiled that smug smile of his, the one that made his eyes crinkle at the corners while remaining completely cold, thinking he'd won. But inside, my mind was sharpening like a blade against a whetstone. I played along on the outside while plotting on the inside. One afternoon, while everyone was out of the house except Soso and me, I noticed her sneaking toward our dad's office. This was strictly forbidden territory. Even my mom wasn't allowed in there without permission. The heavy oak door was usually locked, but today it stood slightly ajar. I quietly followed and watched through the air vent as she opened his desk drawer and took something out. It was a photo. She stared at it for a long time, her small fingers tracing the edges, then tucked it into her pocket and left. Later that day, I followed her to the bathroom and waited until she left. I checked the trash can and found the photo crumpled up at the bottom. It showed a woman who looked a lot like my mom, but younger, with a small child on her lap. Both were smiling, genuine smiles that reached their eyes, not the practiced ones we put on for family photos. I recognized the woman as our Aunt Grace, my mom's sister who no one ever talked about. I'd only seen her once when I was very young, and after that, her name was never mentioned in our house. It was as if she'd been erased from our family history. I started watching Soso more closely after that. I noticed something interesting. When she thought no one was looking, she didn't watch our father with the loyalty and adoration she pretended to have. Instead, her eyes followed him with fear, real, genuine fear. It hit me then that she hadn't betrayed me because she loved him more. She'd done it because she was terrified of him. He'd manipulated her, probably rewarded her for turning on me with small privileges and rare affection, then emotionally abandoned her once she was no longer useful. I knew that feeling too well. We'd all experienced it at some point, that brief moment of being the favorite before inevitably disappointing him and being cast aside. That's when I made a silent pact with myself. I would bring this whole house of cards down, but only if I could get Soso out first. She was still young enough to recover from all this. The rest of us were probably already too damaged, our personalities warped by years of walking on eggshells and navigating his unpredictable moods. I started by trying to build a rapport with Brian, my second oldest brother. At 19, he was the most insecure of my siblings, always living in William's shadow. One day, I caught him alone in the garage smoking a cigarette, another forbidden activity in our house. The smoke curled around his face as he leaned against my dad's pristine workbench, looking both defiant and terrified. Instead of threatening to tell on him, I just asked for one. He was so surprised he actually gave me one, his eyebrows shooting up in disbelief. We smoked in silence for a few minutes, the shared rebellion creating a tentative bond between us, before I casually said, "Remember when you used to play football in middle middle school? You were pretty good, Brian shrugged, flicking ash onto the concrete floor. Yeah, well, Dad made me quit. Why? You could have gotten a scholarship or something. Said it was taking too much time away from my studies, Brian mumbled, but I could see there was more to it. His eyes darkened, and he took another long drag of his cigarette. Over the next few weeks, I kept finding ways to talk to Brian alone. I'd feed him small doubts. Weird how Dad never lets anyone meet his work friends, right? Or, don't you think it's strange that William gets a car, but you have to borrow Mom's minivan? Each comment was like a small chisel, chipping away at the foundation of lies our father had built. Eventually, Brian started opening up. One night, as we sat on the back steps watching fireflies blink in the darkness, he admitted he was scared of our dad, that he only joined in hurting me because he was afraid of becoming the target himself. His voice cracked as he confessed this, shame and fear mingling in his words. Then he told me something interesting. He'd once recorded an argument between our parents, just in case. He wouldn't tell me what was on it, but I could see it was something big. I'll trade you, I offered. I know where Dad keeps his stash. Brian's eyes widened. What stash? His devil's lettuce. It's in the fake air vent in his office. I've seen him get it when he thinks everyone's asleep. This was our dad's hidden vice, the thing he indulged in while preaching strict moral values to us. Brian was shocked, his mouth actually hanging open. I promised to show him proof if he'd let me hear the recording. He agreed, the prospect of catching our father in hypocrisy too tempting to resist. The audio was better than I could have hoped for. It was our dad screaming at our mom, threatening to make her disappear like her sister if she ever questioned him again. There was the sound of something breaking, then our mom crying, her sobs muffled as if she was trying to stay quiet. It was damning evidence of the monster behind the mask. Can I have a copy? I asked Brian. He hesitated, fear flashing across his face. If Dad finds out, he won't, not from me. Brian eventually agreed. I made 3 backup copies and hid them in different places, under a loose floorboard in the basement, behind a cracked tile in the bathroom, and inside a hollowed-out soap bottle I kept in my backpack. I wasn't taking any chances. I started collecting more evidence. I recorded our dad on my phone during one of his rages, hiding the device under a pile of clothes while he screamed at Natalie for wearing a skirt he deemed too short. I took photos of bruises on my arms and legs, documenting the evolution from angry purple to sickly yellow-green. I even managed to capture audio of him bragging to someone over speakerphone about knowing how to keep a house in line and how none of them will ever have the balls to do anything about it. The turning point came about a month later. I was at school, half listening to my English teacher discuss The Great Gatsby, when I got a text from Brian. Dad found something. Get home now. My heart dropped to my stomach. I asked to be excused, claiming a sudden illness, and rushed home to find my room completely torn apart. My mattress was flipped, my clothes scattered everywhere, my few personal possessions thrown carelessly on the floor. My dad stood in the middle of it all, holding one of my SD cards, his face contorted with rage. What is this? He demanded, his face red with rage. I said nothing, which only made him angrier. He grabbed my phone from my pocket and smashed it against the wall, pieces of plastic and glass flying everywhere. Then he grabbed me by the collar and got right in my face, his breath hot and sour. You think you're smart? You think you can collect evidence against me? Who have you shown this to? I still said nothing, my heart hammering in my chest, but my face carefully blank. He slapped me hard across the face, the sound echoing in the small room, then started systematically destroying everything in my room. Through the doorway, I could see Soso watching, her small face pale with fear. For the first time in months, she didn't look away when I caught her eye. She just stood there, witnessing everything, her hands clenched into tiny fists at her sides. That night, I was lying on my bare mattress. He'd taken my sheets and blankets as further punishment when I heard a soft knock. Soso slipped into my room, her footsteps barely audible on the carpet, and sat on the edge of my bed. In the dim light from the hallway, I could see she'd been crying. I think I hate him too now, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't smile or show any emotion. I just nodded. It was the first step toward getting her back on my side. Over the next few days, Soso and I started communicating through notes hidden in books and underplates. We developed a simple code, using innocent-sounding phrases that actually meant something else entirely. We came up with a plan. It wasn't about running away. We'd tried that once when I was 12 and she was 6. Dad had found us at the bus station within hours, his public face all concern and relief, while his eyes promised punishment, and the consequences had been severe. No, this time the goal was different. We wanted to trap him in his own lies. Soso agreed to start asking questions again. Not at home where it was dangerous, but in public where he couldn't react without breaking his perfect gentleman facade. At church, she'd innocently ask, "Daddy, why don't we ever talk about Aunt Grace?" At the grocery store, while standing in the checkout line surrounded by neighbors, she'd say, "What is it you do for work again, Daddy?" My teacher asked, asked, and I didn't know what to say. Each time, he'd maintain his smile, his public mask firmly in place, but I could see the rage building behind his eyes. People started noticing the tension. Our dad's church friends would exchange glances when Soso asked her innocent questions. The cashier at the grocery store would look uncomfortable when Dad's grip on Soso's shoulder tightened just a little too much. The mask was beginning to slip. Meanwhile, I started leaving anonymous notes for our neighbors. Nothing specific enough to be traced back to me, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. The perfect family next door isn't what it seems, or you see him every Sunday, but do you know what he really does to his kids? I'd slip them into mailboxes late at night, wearing gloves to avoid fingerprints, my heart racing with both fear and a strange sense of power. I also started talking to my other siblings more, not about our dad directly, that was still too dangerous, but about normal teenage stuff, movies, school, future plans. I wanted to rebuild some kind of connection with them, to remind them that we were supposed to be allies, not enemies. It worked better with Natalie than with William, who was still firmly under Dad's thumb, still desperate for the approval that would never fully come. One night, I overheard Brian and William arguing in their room. Brian was hammered. He'd started drinking heavily to cope with the stress at home, sneaking bottles from the liquor store where his friend worked. "You know it's all Bell shit, right?" Brian slurred, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "Dad's whole perfect family act. He threatened to throw me out when he caught me kissing Marilyn after prom. Said I humiliated the family name." William told him to shut up, but I could tell the comment had landed. Even William, the golden child who'd always aligned himself with our father, had his doubts. I'd seen it in the way he sometimes hesitated before backing Dad up, in the way he'd occasionally look away during the worst of Dad's tirades. The next day, I found my mom in the garage, sitting in her car but not going anywhere. The engine wasn't even running. She was on the phone, speaking quietly, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of her once beautiful hair, now streaked with premature gray. When she saw me, I expected her to hang up quickly like she usually did when caught doing anything Dad might disapprove of. Instead, she held my gaze and continued her conversation. "Yes, I understand. Tuesday at 2 p.m. Thank you." After she hung up, she looked at me for a long moment, something shifting in her tired eyes. "Sometimes we have to make hard choices to protect the people we love," she said cryptically, before walking past me into the house, her shoulders straighter than I'd seen them in years. It was the first time she'd ever acknowledged, even indirectly, that something was wrong in our family, that maybe she wasn't completely brainwashed after all, that maybe she was finally finding her courage. Things escalated quickly after that. Dad became increasingly paranoid. He installed cameras in the living room and kitchen, claiming they were for our safety. I disabled them one by one, carefully and quietly, using skills I'd learned from YouTube videos watched in the school library. Each time a camera mysteriously failed, I'd leave a small sticky note on the lens with a simple message: "We see you too." The final straw came during a Sunday dinner. We had guests over, Dad's work associates and their wives, all dressed in expensive clothes and wearing practiced smiles. Everyone was playing their part in the perfect family charade. Mom had spent hours preparing a roast with all the trimmings, and we were all wearing our best clothes, the picture of domestic harmony. Then Soso, sweet little Soso, spilled her drink all over one of the men's expensive suits. "I'm so sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all. My hand slipped, just like Daddy's does sometimes when he gets angry. The table went silent. The man's wife looked uncomfortable, dabbing at her husband's suit with a napkin while avoiding eye contact with anyone. Dad's face turned that dangerous shade of red I knew too well. "Kids say the darndest things," he laughed, but it sounded hollow, strained. "Soso, why don't you go help your mother in the kitchen?" "But I haven't told them about the secret room yet," Soso continued innocently, her eyes wide with fake naivety. "The one in your office where you keep all the—" Dad stood up so quickly, his chair fell backward with a loud crash. "That's enough!" he shouted, his perfect mask completely shattered. The guests looked shocked. Dad never raised his voice in public, ever. It was one of his unbreakable rules. Appearances must be maintained at all costs. "I think we should go," one of the men said, standing up and motioning to his wife. The others quickly followed suit, murmuring awkward excuses as they gathered their things. After they left, Dad was livid. He grabbed Soso by the arm and started dragging her toward his office, his fingers digging into her small arm hard enough to leave bruises. I knew what was coming, the belt, or worse. But before he could get her through the door, Brian stepped between them. "Let her go," Brian said, his voice steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes. "Get out of my way," Dad growled, his voice low and dangerous. "No," Brian said simply. Dad looked around at all of us. Mom had come in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her face pale but determined. Natalie stood in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself. Even William looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. For the first time, Dad was facing united resistance. He released Soso's arm and stormed out of the house. We heard his car screech out of the driveway, the tires leaving black marks on the concrete. That night, we had a family meeting, the first real one ever. We gathered in the living room, the space feeling different without Dad's oppressive presence. Mom admitted she'd been talking to a lawyer about divorce options. Brian played his recording for everyone. I showed them my documentation, the photos, recordings, and the timeline I'd carved under the basement stairs. Natalie confessed she'd been saving money from her part-time job, planning to escape as soon as she turned 18. Even William admitted Dad had hit him once when no one else was home. We stayed up late, talking honestly for the first time in years, the words pouring out of us like water from a broken dam. The next morning, Dad still hadn't come home. Mom called a locksmith to change all the locks. She also called her sister Grace, who apparently had been trying to reconnect for years, but Dad had prevented it. 2 days later, Dad finally showed up with police officers, claiming we'd locked him out of his own house, but Mom was ready. She showed the officers the photos of our injuries, played Brian's recordings, and explained the situation calmly. The officers advised Dad to leave peacefully and handle it through proper legal channels. As he was leaving, I caught his eye. For a moment, I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear. He was afraid of me, of what I knew, of what I could prove. "This isn't over," he said quietly as he walked past me. "You're right," I replied. "It's just beginning." I wish I could say everything got better immediately after that, but real life doesn't work that way. Mom filed for divorce. Dad hired an expensive lawyer and tried to paint her as unstable. He claimed all our evidence was fabricated. He even tried to get custody of Soso, knowing she was the one we all wanted to protect most. But he underestimated how much we'd all changed. Mom wasn't the scared, submissive woman she'd been. Brian and William testified about the abuse they'd witnessed and experienced. Natalie shared her journals documenting years of psychological torture, and I presented my digital evidence, the photos and audio recordings, along with the carved timeline from under the basement stairs. Most importantly, Soso stood up in court and told the truth about everything, how Dad had manipulated her into betraying me, how he'd promised to love her more if she reported on everyone else, how he'd then abandoned her emotionally when she was no longer useful. Dad's perfect mask crumbled completely under the weight of all that truth. The judge granted Mom full custody of all minor children and a restraining order against Dad. It's been 6 months since then. We're still dealing with the aftermath. Mom's in therapy, and so are all of us kids. We moved to a smaller house across town, away from the memories. Soso and I are rebuilding our relationship. It's not perfect. I still have moments where I remember her betrayal, but we're getting there. She leaves me little drawings under my pillow sometimes, her way of saying sorry. Brian stopped drinking and started community college. William is learning how to exist without Dad's approval driving his every decision. Natalie is applying to colleges out of state, excited to start fresh somewhere new. As for me, I still have nightmares. I still flinch at loud noises. I still have trust issues that will probably take years to work through. But for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid all the time. I can speak at the dinner table without permission. I have a door on my bedroom that I can close whenever I want. Small freedoms that most people take for granted, but to me, they're everything. Last week, I finally fixed that old bike in the basement. I rode it around the neighborhood, feeling the wind on my face, going wherever I wanted. No rules, no punishments, no fear. I'm not healed or whatever, but I'm free, and right now, that's enough. I finally fixed that old bike in the basement. I took it out for a ride around the neighborhood, feeling the wind on my face. No rules, no punishments, no fear. It felt amazing, like I was actually free for the first time in my life. But that freedom didn't last long. 3 days later, I was riding home from school when a black SUV pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and there was my dad, looking exactly the same except for dark circles under his eyes. "Get in," he said. Not yelling, not threatening, just calm. That scared me more than if he'd been screaming. I pedaled faster, my heart pounding in my chest. The SUV kept pace beside me, not speeding up, just following. When I turned down our street, it drove straight ahead. I rushed inside, locked the door, and called my mom at work. "He's back," was all I needed to say. Mom came home early. She called the police, but they said they couldn't do anything unless he actually violated the restraining order. Seeing me on a public street wasn't technically a violation. They suggested we document any contact and call immediately if he showed up at our house. That night, we had another family meeting. Mom looked tired but determined. "I don't want anyone going anywhere alone for a while," she said. "Buddy system, okay?" We all nodded. Even William, who'd been trying so hard to be independent lately, didn't argue. For the next week, everything was quiet, too quiet. I kept expecting something to happen, for Dad to show up at school, or for one of his sketchy business friends to approach us. But nothing did. I almost wished something would happen, just to break the tension. Then Soso came home from school with a small gift-wrapped box. A man gave this to me at recess," she said, her voice small. "He said it was from Daddy." Mom called the school immediately. They checked the security cameras, but the man had stayed just off school property, where the cameras couldn't see. The principal apologized and promised to alert all staff, but the damage was already done. Dad had found a way to reach us. We didn't open the box. Mom took it straight to the police station. They x-rayed it and found it contained a small teddy bear with a voice recorder inside. When they pressed its stomach, my dad's voice came out. "I miss you, princess. Daddy's coming home soon." The police officer looked uncomfortable. "It's creepy, but not technically threatening," she explained. "We can document it, but you can't do anything," Mom finished, her voice flat. I was getting really sick of hearing that. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how Dad had always been 2 steps ahead of everyone, how he'd managed to manipulate an entire social worker into believing him over me, how even now, with a restraining order in place, he was finding ways to mess with us. Around 2 a.m., I heard a soft knock on my door. It was Brian. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, sitting on the edge of my bed. I shook my head. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Brian finally said. "All those guys who used to come to the house, Dad's business associates. What if they're still working with him?" I hadn't thought about that. Dad's mysterious job, the Eastern European guys with gold chains, the stacks of cash, whatever he was involved in, it wasn't just him. He had connections. "We need to figure out what Dad actually does for work," I said. Brian nodded slowly. "I might know someone who can help." The next day, Brian introduced me to his friend Logan, who worked at the same liquor store where Brian used to get his booze. Logan was a few years older, with a sleeve of tattoos and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. Turned out, Logan's dad was a private investigator. "He mostly does cheating spouse cases," Logan explained, "but he's good at finding information on people. I can ask him to look into your dad if you want." I hesitated. We didn't have much money, and PIs weren't cheap. "He might do it for free," Logan added, seeming to read my mind. "He hates abusers. His mom was in a bad situation when he was a kid." 2 days later, Logan's dad agreed to help us. He was a stocky guy named Ralph, with a receding hairline and kind eyes that didn't match his tough appearance. He asked us a bunch of questions about Dad: full name, birth date, previous addresses, what kind of car he drove, names of any associates we could remember. "I'll see what I can dig up," he promised. "In the meantime, stay alert. Document everything." A week passed with no word from Ralph and no sign of Dad. I was starting to think maybe he'd given up, moved on to terrorize some other family. Then Natalie came home from her part-time job at the library looking pale. "Dad was there," she said, her voice shaking. "He didn't approach me or anything. He was just sitting at a table reading a newspaper. When he saw me notice him, he smiled and left." The next day, William spotted him at his track meet. The day after that, Mom saw him at the grocery store. He never approached, never violated the restraining order. He was just there, watching, letting us know he could get close anytime he wanted. We were all on edge, jumping at every noise, checking over our shoulders constantly. Mom started talking about moving to another state, maybe staying with Aunt Grace for a while. I wasn't opposed to the idea, but something told me running wouldn't solve our problem. Dad would just follow us. Then Ralph called. He wanted to meet in person, said he had information he couldn't share over the phone. We met him at a diner across town, away from our usual hangouts. "Your father's into some shady stuff," Ralph said without preamble, sliding a folder across the table to my mom. "Money laundering mostly. He takes cash from some Eastern European guys, probably substance money, though I couldn't confirm that, and runs it through a series of shell companies. Makes it look legitimate." Mom's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were photos of Dad meeting with various men, documents showing company names I didn't recognize, and printouts of bank statements with large deposits and withdrawals. "Is this enough to get him arrested?" Mom asked. Ralph shook his head. "Not on its own. This is circumstantial. You'd need hard evidence, documents with his signature, recordings of him discussing the transactions. And even then, these guys have expensive lawyers." I felt deflated. We finally knew what Dad did, but it didn't help us. "There's something else," Ralph added, his voice lowering. "Your dad's been making calls to a guy with a record for violent offenses. 3 calls in the past week." Mom went very still. "You think he's hiring someone to hurt us?" "I think you should be careful," Ralph said, "and maybe consider that moving out of state idea sooner rather than later." That night, we started packing. Mom called Aunt Grace, who immediately offered her guest house. We'd leave in 3 days, as soon as Mom could get time off work. In the meantime, we implemented even stricter safety measures. No one went anywhere alone. All doors and windows were double-checked before bed. We even took turns staying awake at night, keeping watch. On the second night, it was my turn to stay up. Around 3 a.m., I heard a noise from the backyard, a soft scraping sound, like someone trying to be quiet, but not quite managing it. I woke Brian without making any noise, just a hand over his mouth and a finger to my lips. He understood immediately, grabbing the baseball bat he'd started keeping under his bed. We crept to the window and peered out. In the dim glow of the security light, I could see a figure by our back door, fiddling with the lock. It wasn't Dad. This guy was bigger, burlier. One of his business associates, maybe. Or the guy with the violent record that Ralph had mentioned. Brian called 911 while I woke everyone else. We huddled in Mom's room, the door barricaded with her dresser, listening to the sounds of someone trying to break in. The minutes stretched like hours as we waited for the police. I held so close, feeling her small body trembling against mine. Finally, we heard sirens. The noise at the back door stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of running footsteps. By the time the police arrived, the intruder was gone. The officers took our statement and looked at the back door, which had several fresh scratches around the lock. They promised to patrol our street more frequently, but said the same thing they always did. Without catching someone in the act, there wasn't much they could do. We left for Aunt Grace's the next morning, not even waiting for Mom's time off to be approved. She called her boss from the road, explaining the situation. We drove straight through, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks, constantly checking to make sure we weren't being followed. Aunt Grace lived in a small town about 6 hours away. Her house was at the end of a long driveway, surrounded by trees, with a separate guest house in the back. It was peaceful, isolated, safe. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. We stayed there for almost a month. Mom found a job at a local doctor's office. We enrolled in the local schools. Slowly, we started to relax, to believe that maybe we really had escaped. Then one evening, as we were all having dinner with Aunt Grace, headlights swept across the front windows. A car was coming up the driveway. "Are you expecting anyone?" Mom asked Grace, her voice tight with fear. Grace shook her head, already moving to lock the front door. We all froze, listening to the sound of a car door slamming, then footsteps on the porch. The doorbell rang, followed by a knock. "I know you're in there," called a voice that wasn't my father's. "I just want to talk." Brian peered through the curtains, then let out a breath. "It's Ralph," he said. We let him in, all talking at once, asking how he'd found us, why he was here. "Your dad's been arrested," Ralph said once we quieted down. "Thought you'd want to know." It turned out that after we left, Ralph had continued digging into Dad's business dealings. He'd found enough evidence to take to the FBI, who'd been investigating the Eastern European guys for years. They'd set up a sting operation, caught Dad red-handed discussing money laundering details with an undercover agent. They found a lot more when they searched his house, Ralph added. Documents, cash, even illegal weapons. He's facing serious charges. Bail was denied because they consider him a flight risk. I couldn't believe it. After everything, it wasn't the abuse that brought him down. It was his shady business. "What about the guy who tried to break into our house?" Mom asked. "They got him too," Ralph said. "He flipped on your dad immediately, told them everything. Said your dad hired him to scare you, maybe rough you up a bit. Nothing lethal, but enough to make you drop the restraining order." We all sat in stunned silence, trying to process this information. Dad was in jail. He couldn't hurt us anymore. It was really over. We ended up staying at Aunt Grace's. The small town grew on us, and it felt good to be somewhere Dad had never been, somewhere without memories lurking around every corner. Mom's divorce was finalized with Dad behind bars. She got everything: the house, which she sold, full custody, child support, not that he could pay it from prison. It's been almost a year now. We're all doing better. Mom smiles more. Brian's doing well in community college. William joined the local track team and actually made friends who like him for him, not because they're afraid of his dad. Natalie got accepted to 3 colleges and is trying to decide which one to attend. So is thriving in her new school, where no one knows our history. As for me, I still have bad days. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear Dad's footsteps in the hallway, but those moments are getting less frequent. I've started talking more in my therapy sessions, actually dealing with stuff instead of just going through the motions. Last week, I found an old bike in Aunt Grace's garage. It needed work. New brakes, oiled chain, patched tires. I spent a few days fixing it up, using the skills I'd learned on that other bike in our old basement. When it was ready, I took it for a ride through town, feeling the wind on my face, going wherever I wanted. No rules, no punishments, no fear, just freedom. And this time, I know it's going to last.